The Sunday morning that changed everything began the way all my best Sundays began, with my hands on the piano keys in the empty choir room, playing nothing in particular, just letting my fingers find whatever the Lord put in front of them. That is how I have always prayed. Not always with words, sometimes with sound. My grandmother Nora used to say that music was the language God spoke before He made the alphabet. And I believed her the way you believe the things that were given to you before you were old enough to question them, fully, in your bones, without argument. The choir room at Greater Triumph Baptist Church in Atlanta smells like wood polish and old hymnals and the particular warmth of a room that has held 1,000 rehearsals. The folding chairs are arranged in a horseshoe around the director's stand. The upright piano sits to the left. On the wall, a framed photograph of the original Greater Triumph Choir from 1962. 32 black men and women in robes, standing proud in a church that was smaller then and more battered and more important to the neighborhood around it than any building has a right to be. I have looked at that photograph so many times that I know every face in it by heart. My name is Celeste Diane Moorefield. I am 52 years old. I have been the director of the Greater Triumph Mass Choir for 18 years, which means I have directed this choir through 3 building renovations, 2 associate pastors, 4 First Sunday formats, 1 global pandemic, and more Sunday morning crises than I could count if I tried. I have directed this choir through the funerals of members I loved and the baptisms of their grandchildren. I have directed it through the deaths of notes that should have been held and the miraculous arrival of harmonies that no rehearsal could have produced. The kind of harmonies that happen when the Holy Spirit decides to show up and do what the choir director could not. I have given this choir 18 years of my life, and I have not once regretted a single Sunday of it. I want you to hold that before I tell you what happened. Hold the 18 years, and the empty choir room, and the piano, and the photograph on the wall, and the particular quality of a Sunday morning before anyone else arrives. Hold it, because what I am about to tell you is going to try to make all of it look like naivety, and I refuse to let it be called that. I loved what I built. What was done inside of it was not my fault, and I will not allow the ending to erase the 18 years that came before it. I was at Greater Triumph by 6:15 that Sunday morning. 3rd Sunday in September. Our fall worship series was launching, which meant a full choir, a special musical selection, and the kind of energy in the building that only happens when a congregation is anticipating something. I had been rehearsing the choir on Tuesdays and Thursdays for 3 weeks to prepare for this morning. The selection was Total Praise by Richard Smallwood, not because it was new, but because I had heard the Spirit speak it to me during my devotional one morning, and I have learned over 52 years to follow what the Spirit says even when the logic isn't immediately clear. I unlocked the choir room. I set my bag on the director's stand. I sat at the piano. And then I reached for my choir folder, the navy blue binder where I keep the sheet music, the Sunday morning schedule, the attendance sheet, the notes I make to myself about dynamics and breath, and the places where a section needs to pull back and let another section carry the weight. I opened the folder and something fell out. A white envelope, unsealed, with my name written on the front in handwriting I did not recognize. Just Celeste. No last name. No return address. No explanation. I looked at it for a moment. Then I put it on the piano ledge because the choir would start arriving in 30 minutes and I had things to do before they got there. Whatever was in that envelope could wait. It waited through warm-ups. It waited through the first run of Total Praise, which the choir delivered at about 70% of what I knew they were capable of, standard for a first run on Sunday morning when voices are still finding their temperature. It waited through the note I gave to the alto section about the transition in the bridge. It waited through the prayer I led before we walked out to take our places in the loft. But when I reached for the folder to check the schedule one more time before we processed in, my hand landed on the envelope and something in my chest said, "Now." I pulled out the single sheet of paper inside. I read it once. Then I stood very still for approximately 10 seconds. Then I folded it, put it back in the envelope, put the envelope in the inside pocket of my choir robe, and I walked out to lead 41 voices in praising the God who, I was about to discover, had been watching a situation I knew nothing about for a very long time. That is the kind of discipline you develop in 18 years of choir direction. Your face belongs to the congregation even when your interior belongs to something else entirely. I have learned to direct through headaches, through grief, through the particular exhaustion of a woman who has been carrying too much. I have learned that the music does not stop because the director is broken. The director stands up, and the music continues, and the falling apart, if it must happen, happens later, in private, where it belongs. That Sunday morning, the choir sang Total Praise at 100%. And I stood at the director's stand with an envelope in my robe pocket that was about to change everything, and I raised my hands, and we worshipped. Let me tell you what the note said, and let me tell you what I knew and what I did not know before I read it. What I knew, Pastor Raymond Eugene Foster had led Greater Triumph Baptist Church for 26 years. He was 58 years old, broad-shouldered, silver-templed, with a preacher's voice that could quiet a room or fill a stadium, and a pastoral presence that had drawn 3 generations of Atlanta families to that red brick building on Hollowell Parkway. He had grown the church from 120 members to nearly 800. He had started a food pantry, a GED program, a summer youth camp, and a scholarship fund that had sent 47 children to college in the last decade. He was, by every measure I had ever applied to him, a man of God. He was also my spiritual authority, my professional colleague, and, I believed, had always believed, my friend. He had hired me 18 years ago when I was 34 and newly widowed and in need of something that would require more of me than grief would allow. He had called me into his office on a Tuesday afternoon and said, "Celeste, I need a choir director who understands that the music ministry is not a performance, it is a ministry. And I believe you are that person." He had said it with the simple directness of a man who had discerned something and was following the discernment. I had said yes before he finished the sentence. What I also knew, First Lady Beverly Foster was a woman I respected deeply. She was 55 years old, a retired elementary school principal, and she ran the women's ministry at Greater Triumph with the same quiet, thorough competence with which she had run school buildings for 20 years. She had been married to Pastor Foster for 31 years. She had raised their 3 children inside the walls of Greater Triumph. She was not a woman who performed faith. She practiced it, daily and practically, in the visiting of the sick and the mentoring of young women and the dignified, consistent presence she brought to every service. I loved Beverly Foster. I want you to understand that clearly, because it matters to what happened after. What I did not know, what the note revealed in careful, legible, agonized handwriting, was that for approximately 11 months, Pastor Raymond Eugene Foster had been in an intimate relationship with a member of my choir. Her name, according to the note, was Lydia, Sister Lydia Ann Chambers, 34 years old, 2nd soprano section, had been at Greater Triumph for 3 years, had joined the choir in her first month, had a voice that sat in the upper register like it belonged to the sky, clear and effortless and slightly cool, the kind of voice that makes an alto director involuntarily close her eyes during rehearsal. I had recruited Lydia into the choir myself. I had mentored her. I had given her solo opportunities. I had written her a letter of recommendation for a choral residency program she had applied to the previous spring. The note was from Lydia. She had written it because she said she could not carry the secret into another Sunday service. She had been trying to end the relationship for 2 months, and Pastor Foster had continued to contact her, pressure her, promise her things she now understood he was never going to deliver. She had written it to me specifically because I was, in her words, the most trustworthy person in this building, and because she did not know who else to turn to, who would handle what she was confessing with both truth and wisdom. She wrote, "I am not writing this to hurt him. I am writing this because silence is making me sick, and I know it is hurting his wife, and I cannot pretend anymore that my voice sounds right to God when I am living a lie. I stood in the choir loft that Sunday morning, and I directed total praise. And I thought about those words. My voice sounds right to God. I thought about Lydia's voice in the upper register, clear and slightly cool. I thought about the 11 months that voice had been carrying something that should not have been there. I thought about Beverly Foster in the front pew in her burgundy suit with her Bible in her lap. I thought about 31 years of marriage. I thought about 47 scholarship children and 800 members and the food pantry and the GED program and the photograph of the 1962 choir on the wall. And I thought about God, who had apparently arranged for this information to land in my specific folder on this specific Sunday, which meant he had decided that I was the person positioned to do something with it. I raised my hands for the final chord. The choir held it beautifully. And in the silence that followed, while the congregation exhaled into worship, I made a decision about what I was going to do. Let me tell you what I did not do. I did not confront anyone in the building that Sunday. I did not pull Lydia aside after service. I did not approach Pastor Foster. I did not say a word to anyone, including the 3 choir members who lingered after rehearsal and the 2 deaconesses who stopped me in the hallway to tell me the choir had been magnificent. I went home. I sat at my kitchen table and I placed the envelope on the surface in front of me, and I looked at it for a long time. Then I opened my Bible to Psalm 37, the psalm my mother had marked in her own Bible with a red ribbon and given to me the week after my husband Marcus died 18 years ago. Fret not thyself because of evildoers, neither be thou envious against the workers of iniquity. I read the whole psalm. Then I read it again. Then I did something I had not done in years. I called my sister, Renata. Renata Moorefield Jacobs is 56 years old, and she is a family law attorney in Charlotte, and she is the most direct person I have ever loved. She answered on the second ring, and when I told her I needed to talk through something serious, she said, "Hold on, let me close my office door." And I heard the click of the door and I started talking. I told her everything. I read her the note. I described Lydia. I described the Fosters. I described my 18 years. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Celeste, what does this require of you?" Not, "What do you want to do?" Not, "What are you going to do?" What does this require? I said, "I think it requires me to go to the right people in the right order and to do it carefully enough that Beverly is protected and the truth comes out in a way that doesn't destroy 800 people's faith community along with one man's infidelity." Renata said, "That's right, and it requires you to document everything first." Renata was the one who told me to photograph the note before I handed it to anyone. She was the one who told me to write down the date, the time, the circumstances of finding it, my own account of every interaction with Lydia and with Pastor Foster that I could remember. She was the one who told me that the note was not mine to act on alone, that it needed to go to the church's deacon board chair, not to the pastor himself, because the pastor was the subject of the allegation. "You are a witness and a steward," she said, "not a judge and not a fixer. Your job is to get the truth to the right hands and then step back and let the process work." I said, "And if the process doesn't work?" She said, "Then you decide what you owe a community that won't protect its own truth. But you do the right thing first and see what happens." I prayed that night in the specific way I pray when I need more than comfort, on my knees, by my bed, with no music and no candles and no atmosphere, just me and God and whatever was honest between us. I said, "Lord, I did not ask to be the one who found this. I did not ask for any of this to be in my hands, but here it is, and I know you didn't make a mistake about where it landed. Give me wisdom that is not smaller than what this situation requires. Protect Beverly. Protect the people in that church who did nothing wrong. And give me the courage to do what I know has to be done without letting fear make me smaller than you made me." I stayed on my knees for a long time. When I got up, I wrote everything down, dates, conversations, details. I wrote for 2 hours. I photographed the note with my phone. I sent the photograph to Renata. And then I called Deacon Chairman Harold Westbrook. Deacon Harold Westbrook was 67 years old, a retired federal postal supervisor, and had served as the chairman of Greater Triumph's Deacon Board for 9 years. He was not a dramatic man. He was not a political man. He was the kind of man who showed up on time, did what he said he would do, and treated the people around him with a consistency so steady that it was almost indistinguishable from love. I trusted him. I had trusted him for 18 years, which is its own form of evidence. I called him Sunday evening. I told him I needed to meet with him privately before the week proceeded. I told him it was serious, that it concerned church leadership, and that he needed to hear it from me directly before he heard it from anyone else. He said, "Can you be here tomorrow morning at 8?" I said yes. I arrived at his home at 8 on Monday, with the original note in an envelope and my written account of everything I knew. I sat across from him at his kitchen table. His wife Carolyn brought coffee she did not need to bring, and then discreetly left the room. And I presented what I had the way Renata had advised me to, calmly, factually, in the order that mattered. Harold Westbrook read the note twice. He read my written account once. He looked at the date I had written at the top, and he set everything down on the table, and he looked out his kitchen window at the backyard where 2 bird feeders caught the morning light. He was quiet for about a minute. Then he said, "How are you, Celeste?" That question undid me briefly. I pressed my hands flat on the table and breathed and said, "I'm holding. I'll be better when this is in the right hands." He nodded slowly. He said, "It's in the right hands." He told me that the deacon board would need to convene privately, without the pastor present, to determine the appropriate process. He told me that Beverly needed to be told, and that the board would take responsibility for that conversation. He told me that my role, going forward, was to continue my ministry and let the board do theirs. He also said something that I have thought about many times since. He said, "Celeste, the church needs you to keep standing. It will try to knock you down, not on purpose, but because that's what upheaval does. I need you to know that your integrity in this moment is not invisible. God sees it, and I see it." I thanked him, and I left. And then I waited. And the waiting was the hardest part. The deacon board moved with a care and thoroughness that I had not fully expected, and for which I will always be grateful. Over the following 2 weeks, they met with Lydia, who confirmed everything in the note and more, with documentation she had kept that I did not know about. Text messages, voicemails, records of correspondence that removed any possibility of the account being disputed. They retained an independent pastoral accountability consultant from the denominational office, a black woman named Dr. Josephine Merritt, who specialized in exactly these situations and who I would come to deeply respect. They made the necessary legal and institutional notifications. And on a Thursday evening, 3 weeks after I found the note, Beverly Foster was told by Deacon Westbrook and Dr. Merritt, in the presence of her oldest daughter, what had been happening in her marriage. I was not in the room. I should not have been. But I thought about Beverly constantly in those weeks, the burgundy suit and the Bible in her lap, and 31 years, and the specific grief of learning that what you trusted completely was not what you believed it to be. I said her name in my prayers every morning. Pastor Foster was confronted by the full deacon board on the Friday of that same week. He did not deny it. I was told, later, by Harold Westbrook, that he had wept and asked for mercy and expressed remorse that was, by the chairman's assessment, genuine but insufficient to address the magnitude of what had occurred. The announcement to the congregation happened on the following Sunday. Deacon Westbrook stood at the pulpit. Pastor Foster was not present in the building, and he told the congregation of Greater Triumph Baptist Church that their pastor was stepping down from leadership, effective immediately, that the reason was a failure of moral and marital integrity that he would not describe in detail from the pulpit out of respect for the families involved, and that the church would be guided through a process of pastoral transition with the support of their denominational leadership. I was in the choir loft when that announcement was made. I had debated all week whether to tell the choir before Sunday, whether to prepare them, whether to step down myself temporarily to give the building space to process without my presence complicating things. I had talked through all of it with Renata and with Dr. Merritt, who had become a quiet guide through those weeks. Dr. Merritt's advice was simple. Stay at your post. Your ministry did not betray this congregation. You did not betray this congregation. Your absence would communicate guilt that does not belong to you. So, I stayed at my post. When Deacon Westbrook finished speaking, the sanctuary was completely silent. The kind of silence that has texture, that you can feel pressing against your skin. I looked out from the choir loft at 800 people absorbing something that was going to change their relationship with this building for a long time. And then, without planning it, without directing it, without raising my hands, one voice in the choir began to hum. A single alto, low and steady. Through it all, the old Andrei Crouch song. And then another voice joined, and another. And within 30 seconds, my entire choir was humming that melody, unrehearsed and unorchestrated, and the sound moved through the sanctuary like something being offered to the wound in the room. I have directed music for 18 years, and I have never been more moved by anything my choir has done. Tears moved down my face. I did not wipe them. I simply stood at my post while my choir did what choirs are meant to do. Held the community in the moments when the community cannot hold itself. That was the turning point. Not the announcement, not the confrontation, not the note. That moment, 41 voices humming in the dark without being told to, was the moment I understood that what had been broken was not greater triumph itself. What had been broken was one man's faithfulness. And the church, if it was going to survive this, was going to survive it with its voice. My voice, their voices, all of us together. The weeks that followed were not clean or easy, and I want to be honest about that because I have no interest in telling you a story that is more triumphant than true. Some members left. That is the reality of a pastoral crisis in a congregation. Some people's faith is built more on the pastor than on the God the pastor was supposed to be pointing them toward. And when the pastor falls, their faith wobbles at the foundation. I watched families that I had known for 15 years begin attending other churches. I watched deacons I respected disagree about the process and the pace and the appropriate level of transparency. I watched young people in the congregation, the ones who were at the most fragile point in their faith development, struggle with a disillusionment that was too complicated to simply pray away. I watched Lydia disappear. She stopped coming to service the week after the announcement, which I understood and did not hold against her. She was dealing with her own consequences, the judgment of people who reduced her role in what happened to a simple villain narrative, which was easier than the more complicated truth. I prayed for her. I did not reach out immediately. That was Renata's advice, and Dr. Merritt's and the wisdom of my own instincts. But I prayed for her every morning alongside Beverly, whose name never left my prayer list. And I dealt with something I had not fully anticipated, the question of what I had known and when. Some people, in the painful, searching way that communities do when they are trying to make sense of a wound, needed to believe that someone had known and said nothing. They needed a person to be angry at who was still present. And some of them decided that person should be me. I heard it through the quiet channels that information travels in church communities. The suggestion that as choir director, as someone who worked closely with both the pastor and with Lydia, I must have seen something, must have suspected something, must have protected something. I had not. I want to say that clearly and without defensiveness. I had not known, had not suspected, had not protected. I had found a note in my choir folder, and I had done exactly what integrity required of me within 24 hours of finding it. But I could not defend myself to every whisper in every hallway, and I made the decision very quickly that I would not try. I said to Renata one night, "People need someone to blame who is still in the room." She said, "Yes, and you have to be big enough to let them do it without becoming it." That was the hardest spiritual work of the season, not the grief, not the institutional disruption, not even the quiet devastation of having the person I had trusted professionally for 18 years revealed as someone I had not fully known. The hardest work was remaining in the building while some of the people in the building were processing their pain by directing it toward me and choosing every single day not to let their narrative become mine. I went to therapy. I want to say that plainly, because there is still a hesitation in some of our communities around naming it, and I was not too proud for it, and I am not too private to acknowledge it. I found a Black female therapist named Dr. Sandra Okafor, who worked specifically with faith leaders and ministry workers, and I went to her every other week for 9 months, and the work I did in that office was as necessary as any prayer I prayed in that season. Dr. Okafor said something in our third session that rearranged something in my interior. She said, "Celeste, you have been the person responsible for the emotional and spiritual atmosphere of a room full of people for 18 years. You have never once had a room that was just for you. That is not sustainable. The reason this crisis is hitting you as hard as it is hitting you is partly the betrayal and partly the fact that you have not had a container for your own interior life in a very long time." I sat with that for the rest of the session and the drive home and most of the following week. She was right. I had poured into that choir room for 18 years, and I had never asked anyone to pour into me. I had mistaken self-sufficiency for strength, and the crisis had broken through that mistake the way a river breaks through a dam that has been holding too much pressure for too long. I started allowing people to pour into me. It was uncomfortable, and I did it anyway. I let Renata come to Atlanta for a weekend, and we cooked together and watched old movies, and I talked about Marcus, my late husband, more than I had talked about him in years, because grief, I was learning, does not finish when you think it finishes. It waits patiently inside you for the next crisis to come along and open the door. I let Deacon Westbrook check on me weekly with a phone call that was brief and consistent and never asked more of me than I could give. I let 3 of my choir members, women who had been singing under my direction for more than a decade, bring me dinner on a Tuesday night and sit at my kitchen table and simply be present with me. I had never let people do that before. I had always been the one at the table with the pots. Letting myself be fed was its own form of healing. The practical dimensions of the crisis required attention alongside the spiritual ones, and I want to tell you about those too, because this is a story about real life, and real life requires both. The church went through a 4-month pastoral transition period guided by the denominational office and Dr. Merritt. An interim pastor was appointed, a woman named Reverend Dorothy Mae Simmons, 60 years old, who had led churches through crisis before and who arrived at Greater Triumph with a calm, clear-eyed competence that the congregation needed and responded to more quickly than I expected. Reverend Simmons was not trying to replace Pastor Foster or to erase what he had built. She was trying to help the congregation hold itself together long enough to find its own footing again. She called me into a meeting in her second week. She said, "Sister Celeste, I have read everything I could find about this music ministry before I arrived, and I need you to know that what you have built here is not something this church can afford to lose right now. I am asking you to stay, and I am asking you to lead with everything you have, even when it is hard." I said, "I have not considered leaving." She looked at me with the appreciation of a woman who understood what it cost to say that. She said, "Good. Then let's talk about what this choir can do for this congregation in the next 6 months." That conversation was the beginning of what I can only describe as the second chapter of my ministry at Greater Triumph. One that was harder than the first and more clarifying, the way difficult seasons always are. I redesigned the choir's role in Sunday worship to be more explicitly pastoral. We began opening each service with a prayer song, not a performance piece, but something meditative and receiving, something that created space for the congregation to arrive emotionally before the sermon began. We started hosting monthly Songs of Healing evenings, informal candlelit services in the fellowship hall where the choir and the congregation sang together without the formality of a Sunday program. No director's stand, no risers. Just 41 voices and however many congregants showed up sitting in a circle, lifting whatever came. The first one drew 60 people, the second drew 90, the third drew 140. I watched people who had been coming to Sunday service with the careful guardedness of the recently wounded begin, slowly, to open. I watched them use music the way my grandmother had always said music was meant to be used, as a language for what could not otherwise be said. I watched an older man who had been at Greater Triumph for 40 years cry during a chorus of "It is well," with the uninhibited freedom of a person who had finally found a room where crying was appropriate. I watched a teenage girl in the second row hum along to something she had never heard before, as though her body already knew the melody. That work, the Songs of Healing Evenings, became the most important thing I have ever done in 18 years of church music. Not because of the quality of the sound, because of what the sound was doing in people who needed it. Meanwhile, in parallel with the ministry work, I was doing something that might surprise you. I was building. My salary as choir director had always been part-time, a stipend in the language of church, though it was the stipend of a person working 40 hours a week. I had supplemented it for years through private voice lessons and occasional freelance work scoring music for small theater productions and corporate events. That freelance work had always been secondary, background, something I did on the edges of the ministry that was my primary identity. During the crisis, something shifted. I started thinking about what it meant to be so completely invested in a single institution that when the institution was shaken, I was shaken entirely. I started thinking about what it would mean to build something that was mine, not in competition with the ministry, but alongside it, creating a stability that did not depend on any one building or any one pastor. Renata had been telling me this for years. Celeste, you need something that belongs to you. You are too talented to have everything in one basket. I had heard her and not quite listened, the way you hear things that are true but inconvenient. I started listening now. I registered a small business. I called it Moorefield Music, simple, mine, in my name. I began formally marketing private voice instruction and choral consulting services to schools, community choirs, and faith organizations. I built a simple website. I printed business cards. I sent emails to 3 schools in the Atlanta area where I had connections through former choir members who had become music teachers. Within 6 weeks, I had 3 new private students. Within 3 months, I had 12, a contract to consult with a middle school choral program, and a small commission to arrange a piece for a regional women's choir festival. The income was not large, but it was mine. It existed outside of Greater Triumph and independent of any pastor and independent of the particular crisis that had shaken the foundation under my feet. And the independence of it, the specific, practical, undeniable independence, did something to my interior that all the prayer and therapy and songs of healing evenings could not do quite the same way. It told me that I was not only a servant of an institution, I was also a builder of something of my own. I want to tell you what Dr. Okafor said when I told her about Moorefield music. She said, "Celeste, this is not separate from your healing. This is part of it. Rebuilding your sense of yourself as someone with agency, someone who creates, not only serves, is how you integrate what happened to you and come out whole." I wrote that in my journal. I have a journal now. Dr. Okafor's suggestion, a place where the interior life has its own room. I write in it most mornings. Sometimes I write prayers. Sometimes I write things I am angry about. Sometimes I write things that confuse me. It has become one of the most important practices of my life, which surprises me because I have always expressed myself through sound rather than words, and yet there is something that words can hold that music cannot, and I needed to find that container. Beverly Foster reached out to me 7 months after the announcement. I want to tell you about this carefully, because it is the part of this story that required the most of me and that produced the most unexpected grace. She called on a Tuesday evening. I did not recognize the number. She was calling from a new phone, and when I answered and heard her voice, I was not prepared for the specific quality of it. She sounded quieter than I remembered, more internal, but she did not sound broken. She sounded like a woman who has been through something that has stripped away everything that was not essential and found that what remained was more solid than she expected. She said, "Celeste, I want to thank you." I said, "Beverly." She said, Please let me say this. I said, Yes, ma'am. She said, When I found out how the truth came to light, that you found that note and took it to Harold within 24 hours and protected me the whole time and never said a word publicly, I want you to know what that meant to me. I have been betrayed by my husband. I was not betrayed by you. And in a season where I have been taking inventory of who I can trust, your name is on the right side of the ledger. I needed to tell you that directly. I was quiet for a moment. Then I said, I love you, Beverly. I loved you before this happened, and I love you in it, and I will love you on the other side. That is not complicated for me. She cried briefly, the kind of brief, controlled cry of a woman who has already done the heavy crying and is in the rebuilding stage. Then she said, I heard about the Songs of Healing evenings. I want to come. She came the following month. She sat in the circle with 120 other people, and she did not sit up front, and she was not pointed out, and nobody made an announcement. She was just a woman in the circle singing Blessed Assurance, with her eyes closed and her hands open in her lap. I saw her from across the room, and I felt something that I can only describe as the specific gratitude of a woman who has done a hard thing correctly and been allowed to see the evidence of it. Beverly Foster is today one of the women who helps lead our Songs of Healing ministry. She does not stand at the front, and she does not direct, and she does not speak publicly about what she went through. But she is present every month, and her presence communicates something to the women who come through that door, particularly the women who come because something in their own life has been shaken, that no announcement or program could communicate. Her presence says, you can survive what tried to bury you and come back into the room. The new pastor of Greater Triumph Baptist Church was called 12 months after the announcement. His name is Pastor Jerome Alton Graves, 49 years old, previously the senior pastor of a congregation in Memphis, a man with serious theological training and a gentle, honest preaching style that does not perform certainty it does not have. He arrived with his wife, Minister Tamara Graves, who is herself an ordained minister, and their presence in the building felt from the first Sunday like something was being correctly calibrated. He called me into his office in his first month. He had done his research. He knew the 18 years. He knew the Songs of Healing evenings. He knew about Moorefield music. He said he wanted to understand my vision for the music ministry going forward and whether I saw my role at Greater Triumph as long-term. I said, Pastor Graves, I want to be honest with you about something I have learned this year. I have spent 18 years building something in this building, and I am still committed to that ministry. But I am also building something that is mine, outside these walls, and I need both of those things to be able to give my best to either. I am not a person who can pour out indefinitely without having a vessel of my own. He looked at me for a moment. He said, That is the most honest answer I have received from any ministry leader since I arrived, and it tells me exactly what I need to know about you. He offered me a formal, salaried director of worship arts position, a newly structured role with a written job description, benefits, and a salary that reflected the actual scope of what the music ministry required. Not a stipend, a salary. I accepted it, and I kept Moorefield Music. Because I had learned in the year that broke me open and rebuilt me differently that being whole is not a destination. It is a daily practice. It is the choice to hold more than one thing at once, the institutional and the personal, the service and the self, the voice that leads 41 others and the voice that belongs only to you. Almost 2 years after I found that note in my choir folder, I stood at the director's stand on a Sunday morning in September, full circle, the third Sunday, the fall worship series launching again, and I looked out at the choir I had built and rebuilt and held together through the hardest year of my professional life. 43 voices now, 2 new members who had joined in the spring. The selection was, We've come this far by faith. Not a complicated choice, not a performance piece. A declaration. I raised my hands, and they sang it the way you sing something you have earned the right to sing, from a place that is deeper than talent, from a place that is deeper than rehearsal, from the specific depth of people who have held each other through something real and come out still standing. I sang too. I have always directed from my voice as much as from my hands, because I learned that from my grandmother, and I have never stopped believing she was right. I opened my mouth and I sang with my choir, and the sound we made together filled that sanctuary the way the sanctuary was always meant to be filled. After service, a young woman approached me in the hallway. She was 26 years old, new to the choir, had joined 2 months earlier. Her eyes were red from something that had been happening before she arrived at church that morning. She said, "Sister Celeste, can I ask you something?" I said, "Of course." She said, "How did you stay? After everything that happened here, I heard about it before I joined. How did you stay when things got that bad?" I looked at her for a moment. I thought about the note in my choir folder, about Beverly's voice on the phone, about Renata at my kitchen table, about Dr. Okafor's office, about songs of healing evenings in a circle, about Moorefield music and the first student and the first invoice I sent that had my name and my business name on it. I said, I stayed because the music ministry is not the same thing as the people who misused it. The calling is not the same as the one who betrayed the calling. And I had to learn the difference between what needed to leave and what needed to stay. The lies needed to leave. The man who lived them needed to face what he had done. But the ministry, the music, the community of people who were not guilty of anything, that needed someone to stay for. So I stayed. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I needed to hear that. I hugged her the way women in black churches have always hugged each other when words are insufficient, firmly, with both arms, without rushing the release. And I thought, this is why you stay. Not for the institution, not for the position, not for the 18 years or the salary or the director's stand. You stay for the moments when someone who is carrying something she cannot yet name comes to you in a hallway and needs to hear that survival is possible and that staying is a choice, and that the music does not stop because one person decided his calling was less important than his desire. The music does not stop. It finds a new voice. It finds a deeper chord. It finds the harmony that was always there, waiting beneath the surface, ready to rise when the room finally has ears to hear it. A reflection for the woman who is still finding her voice. Betrayal in a sacred place leaves a wound that is specific in its depth. The church was supposed to be shelter. The pastor was supposed to be shepherd. When those who carry the symbol of God's authority misuse it, the faith of the people around them becomes collateral damage in ways that are not their fault and cannot always be quickly repaired. But hear me when I say this. The symbol is not the source. The pastor who failed his wife and his congregation and the woman he drew into his failure was not the representation of God. He was a human being who failed to live up to the representation entrusted to him. And human failure, as devastating as it is, cannot unmake what God has made. Proverbs 4:18 says, The path of the righteous is like the morning sun, shining ever brighter till the full light of day. The path does not end where the betrayal happened. It continues. It gets brighter. The woman who was faithful in the darkness is the one who sees the dawn first. If you are rebuilding your faith after someone in spiritual authority disappointed you, if you are in the choir loft wondering whether the worship is still real, whether the community is still safe, whether your calling is still yours, I want you to hear this. Your calling did not belong to the person who betrayed it. It was never theirs to give, and it is never theirs to take. What God placed in you before that person arrived in your life is still there, still real, still necessary. The wound is real. The path continues. And the music, your specific, irreplaceable, God-given music, does not stop. It finds a new voice. And that voice is the one the room has been waiting for all along. If this story moved something in you, if you have ever stayed when leaving would have been easier, or if you have ever rebuilt something from what the betrayal left behind, I want to hear from you. Leave a comment below. Tell me what you stayed for. Tell me what you built. Like this video, if it spoke to you, it helps more women find it who need to hear it. Subscribe to Sister Circle Stories, because every week we gather here to tell the truth about faith and survival and the music that continues even when the voices around us fail. We are here. We are not going anywhere, and neither are you.